You're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Press United reports, according to the French President Emmanuel Macron, the continent, that being Europe, must decide whether it wants to be free or a quote-unquote vassal of China or the United States. Is the bloom coming off the rose? Well, for insight, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So the article continues, Europe has found itself in the throes of an unprecedented crisis over the Ukraine conflict. French President Emmanuel Macron said yesterday. He added that the continent has to choose whether it wants to be free or become totally dependent on either U.S. or China. And Dr. Horne, this comes on the heels of German General Erich Vodd, former military advisor to Angela Merkel, telling U.S. generals they need to lose the Ukraine war as soon as possible to prevent losing the empire in Europe. Is the bloom coming off the rose, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Well, I think that there is something to that. What I mean is that Mr. Macron, who is facing unparalleled protests in the streets of France because of his attempt to raise the retirement age, is acutely aware of the dilemma now faced by the European Union. What I mean is that Mr. Macron and his class, the 1% of France, they feel that they have to drive down French workers' living standards and working standards to the level of the so-called global South, which, of course, is at that low level because of French colonialism. But Mr. Macron now feels he has to drive down his own working class's level to that level in order for France to be competitive. But with the progressive traditions in France, that's basically a non-starter. And Mr. Macron, more than most, recognizes the inherent debilities of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, now facing off with Russia in Ukraine. Recall that it was only a few years ago that he referred to NATO as brain dead. And the patient has not been revived. NATO is in some ways like a dead man walking, although somehow that has not percolated down to the corridors of power in the Pentagon and in Brussels, where NATO is headquartered. And then Mr. Macron might have seen the article in the French publication Le Figaro by featuring the words of the well-known French intellectual Emmanuel Todd, where he suggests that Ukraine has ignited the incipient stage of World War III, with Russia and France on one side of the barricades, and the United States and its North Atlantic allies, perhaps Japan and South Korea, if they don't skedaddle first, on the other side of the barricades. And if you read his words carefully, he feels that the apparent hegemony of the North Atlantic bloc may not survive a World War III, as he calls it. And in that sense, what he's saying is consistent with the words of the German general who you quoted in your opening remarks. And so what this suggests is that Mr. Macron is on point when he tells El País, the Spanish periodical, that France faces a real dilemma right now. Because even though those who look at these matters blissfully and blithely may concede that, well, the United States, they faced the debacle in Vietnam, and U.S. imperialism survived. They survived the fiasco in Iraq. They survived the catastrophe in Afghanistan. So what's one more catastrophe? Speaking of the incipient stages of World War III, well, obviously the difference is they're not only facing off against two nuclear-armed powers, speaking of Russia and China, but as well, China is the number 2 economy, but in the passing lane. which then leads us back to Mr. Macron's remark that the European Union is facing the prospect of being either a vassal of Washington or a vassal of Beijing. And to that end, pay attention to Mr. Macron's next trip. He's headed to China, of course. And you also know that he was in Washington in early December. Supposedly, he and Mr. Biden were all buddy-buddy, but behind the scenes, as press reports have exposed, there was a lot of gnashing of teeth and wringing of hands amongst the French circle accompanying Mr. Macron about the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides subsidies for the green economy for U.S. businesses or those who would like to build in the United States. This is attracting a passel of EU corporations across the Atlantic to the detriment of the European Union. It's causing the European Union to engage in similar parallel measures. There's serious talk about a trade war erupting between Brussels and Washington. At the same time, they're trying to unite to confront Russia. This would not be unique. Recall that Airbus and Boeing have been at each other's throats for years now, and I could go down a similar list of competitors that are at each other's throats.
The submarine issue.
The AUKUS submarines.
Oh, of course. And this also reminds me of the point made in the recent book by the Columbia professor, Anu Bradford. The book is called The Brussels Effect, How the European Union Rules the World. Now, in light of what we've just said, that particular book title might go down in history with Dewey Defeats Truman in 1948. I mean, the European Union is in dire difficulty, dire trouble, which is one of the reasons why you get these alarmist appeals coming not only from French presidents, but from leading French intellectuals and German generals.
South Africa, and I think this is connected. So that's why I go to Africa, because of French imperialism in Africa and France having, their finger on the pulse of what's really going on in Africa. I think that Macron is probably taking the African dynamics into account when making his evaluation. South Africa is set to host a joint military exercise with Russia and China for 10 days in February as a means to strengthen the already flourishing relations between South Africa, Russia, and China. A multinational maritime exercise between these three countries will take place, the South African National Defense Force said. Dr. Horne, your thoughts?
Well, what's interesting about that story is that Washington is up in arms about these military maneuvers, despite the fact that the South African military has engaged in military maneuvers with the Pentagon's finest, so-called. So why are they objecting if South Africa, which after all is a member of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And the BRICS, as is well known, is perceived as a dire threat to the domination of the so-called G7, the United States, its Western European allies, plus Canada and Japan. And so that's why the United States is objecting to these military maneuvers. But I think that Washington needs to realize that mule has left the barn. Already we see the BRICS on the path of expansion. Saudi Arabia supposedly wants to be part of the BRICS. Turkey supposedly wants to be part of the BRICS, which is interesting given its role as the eastern flank of NATO. And so I would urge and caution the hotheads in Washington to cool their jets, because they do not want to alienate further the continent's giant, speaking of South Africa, which already is upset with Washington because Washington won't lift its sanctions against Zimbabwe, South Africa's neighbor to the north, which simultaneously is harming the South African economy. So once again, rather than try to adjust to reality, the United States and its allies are trying to bend reality to its will, but that's not working.
Going back to President Macron's statement, he talks about wants to be free or a vassal of China or the United States. Do you think, I'm trying to figure out why he threw China into that conversation, because A, he's going to China shortly. B, the relationship with China is a trade relationship, not a military relationship, whereas it's the United States military blunders that are causing the intestinal unrest in France. So the relationships are different. So did he throw China in the mix so that he would not be accused of targeting the United States?
Well, that's a possibility. As you know, relations between the United States and France have been complex and difficult. It suffered a real downturn in 1956 after France joined Israel and Britain in attacking Nasser's Egypt over control of the Suez Canal, but then had to back down because Uncle Sam, in the form of President Eisenhower, issued veiled threats and warnings. France drew the conclusion that Uncle Sam was unreliable. Britain drew the opposite conclusion, decided to tie itself closer to Uncle Sam's apron strings. And then France was upset when John F. Kennedy pulled the plug on U.S. support for the French colonial exercise in Algeria. Recall that France considered Algeria and North Africa to be part of France itself. It was sort of a settler colony of France. But Washington saw an advantage in terms of backing away from French colonialism. France has not forgotten that either. And recall as well that France preceded the United States in terms of recognizing the People's Republic of China. Recall as well that when Chancellor Scholz of Germany went to Beijing with a plane load of business executives from Berlin, that supposedly as part of that trip, Mr. Macron would accompany Chancellor Scholz, which would have been breathtaking in terms of its dimensions. But for various reasons, that did not go forth, and now he's traveling apparently solo within days or weeks. And so I think it's fair to say that we're living in a time of tumult. We're living in the beginning stages of a new world order, but unlike the so-called New World Order that emerged in 1989, 1990, and 1991, this one is emerging with the apparent winner of that last epochal change, speaking of 30-odd years ago. This time, the apparent winners 30-odd years ago are the apparent losers in 2023.
You know, let me throw an article. It just came out today out of left field at you, Dr. Horne. I want to ask what you thought. You know, the negotiations are going on with the debt ceiling, and there's all this talk about between the Democrats and the Republicans what they're going to do as far as Medicare and Social Security, and many feel that the Democrats may go along with the Republicans and do something that we would all regret. And here's an article. Trump tells Republicans to leave Medicare and Social Security cuts out of negotiations as the debt ceiling showdown heats up. That's why I keep saying they can't count Trump out, because he has some political inclinations of knowing what to say, even though he might not do it when he gets in office, of knowing what to say that some of the other mainstream Republicans don't. And he has a way of end-arounding them. I wouldn't underestimate him. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, I think that's a fair assessment. Indeed, 2024 may play out like 2016. Recall that what happened then was that there were all of these competitors, including Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio and John Kasich and all the rest, and they sliced up the anti-Trump vote, leaving Mr. Trump with still a hefty portion of the GOP primary vote. I think that 2024 will probably be a replay, but this time Pence and Pompeo and Nikki Haley, perhaps Marco Rubio, Rick Scott of Florida, did I mention Michael Pence, slicing up the vote and leaving Trump to emerge once again as the nominee. But with regard to the debt ceiling, there's another aspect to that negotiation, which is quite intriguing. What I mean is that as we speak, Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen is meeting with her Chinese counterparts in Switzerland. There is a possibility, if not a danger, that China, as one of the major holders of U.S. debt, will find itself holding an empty bag. That is to say, the United States will renege on paying back to China for that $1 trillion, more or less, that the People's Bank has loaned to the U.S. government for everything from the Pentagon to the post office, which makes even more ironic, if not paradoxical, this idea that China is in the crosshairs of U.S. imperialism when you have the Secretary of Treasury begging bowl in hand in Switzerland, begging China to be understanding if they don't pay the money in time. Whereas China is probably paying the soundtrack of Rihanna. And I don't have to tell you what the name of that tune is. The epithet excluded, deleted, better have my money.
Quickly, scholars, lawmakers outraged over DeSantis's rejection of AP African American curriculum. Academics and Democratic lawmakers reacted angrily yesterday after the announcement of Republican Florida DeSantis's administration rejected a new high school advanced placement African American studies course without even seeing the syllabus, claiming it violates the state's ban on woke education and lacks educational value. Dr. Horne.
Well, obviously, Governor DeSantis is intending to run for president on an anti-Black platform. But more than this, I think that what this maneuver in Florida exposes and reveals is not only the anti-Blackness and hostility to Black people that inheres, that oozes from every pore of U.S. history and culture, which makes it difficult for those who rule this country to entertain the idea that this history should be taught. And this occurred to me as well as I was screening the new Viola Davis vehicle, The Woman King, which is a Hollywood production. It's made about $100 million at the box office. And so it's not any sort of inherently progressive enterprise, but by simply telling the story of the slave trade and telling the story of how Africans saw being transported to the United States as a defeat, as clearly it would be because they'd be transported to be enslaved, that inherently there is a contradiction about telling an accurate story with regard to Black people and Black history, and glorifying the history of the United States of America.
Dr. Joe Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciate that analysis. We look forward to having you back.